Hi, Grandma here reading Ben and Me by Robert Lawson. Chapter 5, we do some printing. And we have a picture of them with the printing. We have a picture of Amos sitting right over here and Ben Franklin over here. One of Ben's chief interests, of course, was printing. I said that he wrote so much stuff that the only thing to do with it was to print it. He felt differently about it, and it was the foundation of his fortune. The dissemination of knowledge was man's highest calling. That's, remember, called a maxim or an adage. The dissemination of knowledge was man's highest calling. That means the sharing of knowledge is the most important thing a person can do. Consider poor Richard's Almanac, Ben would say. Consider the good that is done for countless thousands. Consider the information. Oh, that thing that tells when the sun rises and sets. What good is that to anyone? When the sun's up, it's up. Why read about it in a book? But, said Ben, consider the maxims it contains. Think of the lives that have been molded by their wisdom. Consider them, I snorted. Have I ever time to consider aught else? Here we have maxims for breakfast, dinner, and supper. Had they molded your life? Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Bah! When have you ever been to bed early or risen early, except when you had insomnia? Yet you're healthy and wealthy. Well, perhaps if I lived by the maxim, I should also be wise, he suggested meekly. Well, that I doubt, said I. It would require more than a maxim, a miracle, more like it. Then there's that horrid one you wrote. The cat in gloves catches no mice. There's a fine idea to be putting into the heads of cats, and you, my friend. Oh, I'm sorry about that one, truly, said Ben. It was done before your arrival. I shall delete it on the next edition. Left to myself, said I, I'd delete the whole thing. That, he said, would be a great mistake, for many thousands are sold each year at no little profit to us, and profits, Amos, buy bread and leisure and cheese. There seemed to be some reason in that, so we let the matter drop. We used to spend a good deal of time at Ben's printing shop, for although he had more or less retired, he still loved to putter around among the presses, reading proofs, getting in the way generally. The long afternoons there, while splendid for napping, sometimes were a bit tiresome, so I used to putter about some myself. I stayed well away from the presses, however, having suffered a most painful injury to my tail in one of them. One afternoon, while thus idling about, I came upon the type forms for poor Richard's Almanac, all set up and ready to print. The first thing to catch my eye was that odious cat in gloves maxim, which Ben, of course, had forgotten to delete, so I deleted it. It was rather fun picking out the letters and dropping them on the floor, so I continued with a few more alterations. Each maxim read, as poor Richard says, or says poor Richard. Now, there never was any real Richard, poor or not. Ben just made him up, and I always considered it downright dishonest. So, whenever the name occurred, I removed it and substituted Amos. That was not vanity on my part, but merely a desire for honesty, for there really was an Amos. Besides, it was the only name I could spell. I spent a happy afternoon and had time enough left to make a few corrections in the tide table where it appeared wrong to me, as well as some risings and settings of the moon. I did not bother to tell Ben of these improvements, for he was busy with other concerns, but a week later they were brought to his attention in rather dramatic fashion. In the midst of our after-supper nap came a great rapping at the front door, and the harbor master burst in a state of utmost terror. "Fly, Dr. Franklin, fly for your life," he shouted. "Oh, calm yourself, friend," said Ben. "Haste makes waste, you know. What appears to be your trouble?" "Trouble?" sputtered the man. Trouble enough with a harbor filled with ships aground. Do you realize that this thing, waving the almanac under Ben's nose, predicts high water at 10 o'clock, that 18 ships set sail at 10 o'clock, that every last one of them went high and dry aground at 10 o'clock. Why? Because the tide was low at 10 o'clock. That's why. Do you realize that the shipmasters are on their way here now to mob you? Do you realize that the moon you predicted? Oh, never mind the moon, interrupted Ben, snatching the almanac and quickly running through it. He was frowning and I could hear him mumble. Amos says Amos. Amos says. We could hear shouts and the tramping feet of the shipmasters outside. One or two vegetables mashed against the windows. The harbor master hid in the closet, but Ben suddenly smiled and opening the window, calmly stepped out on the balcony. Friends, he said, there has been a great mistake. The crowd agreed with jeers, catcalls, and more vegetables. But, he went on, no mistake on poor Richard's part or mine. For this, my friends, holding up the almanac, this is no almanac of mine. In the true Poor Richard almanac, there are divers maxims, adages, proverbs, sayings, and bits of wisdom and information, all spoke by Poor Richard. If you will but look with care at that spurious counterfeit of my almanac, you will find nowhere in it the name Poor Richard, but only that of one Amos, no doubt a contemptible, ignorant, and inaccurate fellow. No, my friends, this is but a foul hoax, perpetuated by an envious rival who hopes to thus discredit the true Poor Richard's almanac. Hereafter always insist on the genuine and accept no substitutes. There was considerable mumbling and thumbing of almanacs under the torchlight, and one or two voices could be heard to say, Gummy's right, oh good old Ben. Moreover, friends, Ben added, according to the calculations of the real Poor Richard, whose accuracy has never been questioned, the tide will be high precisely at 3:37 o'clock. I should advise, therefore, that you return to your ships with all haste, for they will soon be afloat. They hastened off, and Ben saw the still trembling harbor master to the door. Here's a picture of the mob. And they're holding their almanacs and looking very angry. When he returned, he looked very stern and solemn. Amos, he said, I smell a rat. He may have smelled a rat, but he certainly saw no mouse, for I was well hid under the deepest pile of litter, and there I stayed for 2 days. Okay, the next chapter, 6, is about electricity, and oh my goodness, Amos looks like he is getting a shock. Electricity. Ben never thereafter mentioned my little adventure in printing, so I tried to be somewhat more lenient about his maxims. Trying though they were, however, they were nothing compared to an enthusiasm which beset him about this time. This was the study of what he called electricity. It all started with some glass tubes and a book of instructions sent him by a London friend. These tubes he could roll with a piece of silk or fur, thereby producing many strange and to me unpleasant effects. When a tube was sufficiently rubbed, small bits of paper would spring from the table and cling to it, or crackling sparks leap from it to the finger of anyone foolish enough to approach. This is what we call static electricity. Ben derived great amusement from rubbing the tube and touching it to the tip of my tail. And I think that's what the picture is. It kind of reminds me of when I was a teacher and the students would, we had carpet in the classroom, and they would scoot on the carpet until they touched someone and the electricity went to them. Ben derived great, but don't you try that. That's not very nice. Ben derived great amusement from rubbing a tube and touching it to the tip of my tail. Thereupon a terrible shock would run through my body. Every hair and whisker would stand on end, and a convulsive contraction of all my muscles would throw me several inches in the air. This was bad enough, but my final rebellion did not come until he, in his enthusiasm, used the fur cap to rub the tube, and I was in the cap. Ben, said I, this has gone far enough. From now on, kindly omit me from these experiments. To me, they seemed a perfectly senseless waste of time, but if they amuse you, all right, go ahead with them. Just leave me out. I fear that you are not a person of vision, Amos, said he. You fail to grasp the worldwide, the epoch-making importance of these experiments. You do not realize the force. Oh, don't I? I replied. My tail is still tingling. Oh, I shall tear the lightning from the skies, he went on, and harness it to do all the bidding of man. Personally, said I think the sky's an excellent place for it. Nothing I could say, though, served to dampen Ben's enthusiasm. Soon he received an elaborate machine that could produce much greater currents than the glass tubes. It was worked by a crank, which he ground at happily for hours. Our room became cumbered with rods, wires, tubes, copper plates, and glass jars filled with evil-smelling liquids. It was difficult to move about without touching something likely to produce one of those hair-stiffening shocks. Ben even went so far as to organize a group of similarly obsessed people, calling it the Philosophical Society. They gathered once a week, armed with their glass tubes, bits of silk, and wires. They spent whole evenings fiddling with these things or listening to long speeches about the wonders of electricity, mostly by Ben. I napped. After he'd played with the new apparatus for a few weeks and had it working well, Ben decided to give an exhibition of his achievements in the field. A large hall having been secured for the occasion by the Philosophical Society, Ben spent several busy days arranging and testing his apparatus, planning various experiments, writing a speech, and inviting prominent people. Finally, I was bored by the whole affair, but since Ben seemed rather hurt by my attitude, I tried to take a little interest. I read his speech and the descriptions of all the various experiments. By noon, I understood everything quite thoroughly. We have a picture, and over here in the corner is Amos observing Ben with his apparatus for his experiments. While we ate a light lunch of bread and cheese, I told Ben of my studies. He was delighted and quite touched by my interest. In the afternoon, he went to have his hair curled, leaving me in the hall, where I went with my research. Determined that no error should mar this performance since it meant so much to Ben, I carefully went over each wire and piece of apparatus, comparing them with his diagrams and descriptions. I discovered that he had apparently made several grave mistakes, for not a few of the wires were connected in a manner that seemed to me obviously incorrect. There were so many of these errors to rectify that I was kept quite busy all afternoon. My corrected arrangements seemed to leave several loose wires and copper plates with no place to go, so I just left them in one of the chairs on the stage. I was barely able to finish before Ben arrived from the hairdresser's. Well, I hope his changes doesn't hurt the experiments. He didn't do a very good job of adjusting the tide tables during the Almanac. As we hurried home for supper, he was so filled with pride and excitement that I had no opportunity to tell him how narrowly he had escaped ruining the exhibition by his carelessness. When we arrived back at the hall in the evening, the brilliantly lit auditorium was crowded. Seated in chairs on the stage were the governor and his lady, the mayor, several of the clergy, and the chief of the volunteer fire brigade holding his silver trumpet. Ben made a speech, and performed several simple experiments with the glass tubes. They were watched with great interest by the audience and generously applauded. He then stepped to the new apparatus and signaled to a young apprentice from the print shop who was stationed at the crank. The lad turned with a will, and a loud humming sound came from the whirling wheel while blue sparks crackled about it. "And now, my friends," said Ben proudly, "when I turn this knob, you shall see if my calculations are correct. A manifestation of electrical force never before witnessed on this continent." They did. As Ben turned the knob, the governor rose straight in the air and in much the same manner that I used to when Ben applied the spark to my tail. His hair stood out just as my fur did. His second leap was higher and his hair even straighter. There was a noticeable odor of burning cloth. On his third rising, the copper plate flew from the chair, landing unfortunately by his lady's lap. Her shrieks, while slightly muffled by her wig, was nevertheless noteworthy. Here's a picture. But here, somebody is over here laughing, it looks like. And I don't think that's Ben, and I know it's not Amos, so we'll have to find out who that is. Oh, that's the apprentice turning the crank. The fire chief gallantly advanced to their aid, inadvertently touched one of the wires with his silver trumpet. This at once became enveloped in a most unusual blue flame and gave off a strange clanging sound. Ben leaped forward then, but I clamped onto his ear and I felt those shocks before. "The boy!" I hissed. "Stop the machine!" He sprang at the apprentice who was still grinding merrily. The lad, not an admirer of the governor, ceased his efforts with some reluctance, so he was laughing at the governor. The governor was stiff and white in his chair. His lady moaned faintly under her wig. The fire chief stared dazedly at his tarnished trumpet, and the audience was in an uproar. "Never mind, Ben," I consoled as we walked home. "I feel certain we'll succeed the next time." "Succeed?" shouted Ben. "Succeed? Why, Amos, don't you realize that I have just made the most successful, the most momentous experiment of the century? I have discovered the effects produced by applying strong electric shocks to human beings." "Granted the governor is one," I said. "We surely did." So apparently the improvements that Amos made did indeed help Ben this time. Well, the next chapter is called Chapter 7, The Lightning Rod. Do you know what a lightning rod is? A lightning rod is put on, especially older homes, especially if they're on a hill, to keep the house from being struck by lightning and burning down. And they were metal sticks that had glass balls on them, so that the lightning would strike right there and a wire would go down the outside of the house into the ground and the electricity would be dispersed through the ground. But we'll find out more about it the next time. Bye-bye.